today. But for those that don't know it, Henry sits on the scientific review committee for the Regeneron International Science and Engineering Fair. He's the perfect person to give us some training and some background on the rules, how to handle certain situations, and how for us to best make sure that our students follow the rules so that there are no disqualifications, cancellations, or problems. So Henry, take it away.
Okay, well, I'm kind of going to follow this checklist for adult sponsors. Some of you have got that or whatever, but I find that's the easiest way. We're going to start with human subjects because that seems to be the most complicated. For all projects involving human subjects, wait, Bob Solomon, okay, oh, I see what you're doing. So for all human subject studies, it requires an IRB, which stands for Institutional Review Board. This is due to federal regulations. I forget the numbers, 46 CR 45, something like that. But again, these are federal regulations that were initially instituted after the Nuremberg trials. So anybody dealing with human subjects needs to be reviewed by an Institutional Review Board or some kind of a review board. So the question is, we've got a lot of students that are working with human subjects in various areas, but there's two types of IRBs. One, there's a school IRB, which is what most of you have been dealing with. There's also institutional IRBs. The difference between the two depends on where the subjects are coming from. So if the subjects are coming from any institution that has an IRB, this could be a university, a research lab, old age home, whatever. A lot of them have IRBs and you have to use those. Most of you are going to be running into students from the school, so the school needs to form an IRB. This review board needs to have at least three people on the board. One is an administrator. A lot of schools have those, too many sometimes. Also a medical or social science person, and a teacher, but not the teacher that's dealing with the student. We have a problem with that. It's called conflict of interest. We can't have the teacher dealing with reviewing this because the teacher is obviously pretty close to that. So it needs to have those three. And there could be another one that is needed depending on the subject of the study. You might need, a neuroscientist, for example, if they're dealing with something like that, and so that person could join the board. Email is good to verify who that person is and what they are doing. So that is what an IRB is. So all of them need to do that. Each school needs to form their own IRB. The thinking is that the schools know the community and their population better than anybody else. So they'll put that together, and then this group will review the projects. All of this then would be documented by Form 4, human subjects. This Form 4 will require obviously the name of the student, the project, and then there are boxes. There's a box in the center of the form. And Bob, can you bring up that Form 4? Is that possible? If not, there it is. So obviously the top part's completed by the student. Below is IRB use only, and those boxes need to be checked. The IRB is going to be looking at the project and then determining the risk level, whether it needs a qualified scientist, whether it needs a risk assessment, and what kind of consents does it need, and then they sign it. They would print their name, and then they would sign it and date when they signed. Okay, must be prior to experimentation. With ISEF, we have the biggest problem with this. One of our big problems is that, as you know, and there are plenty of schools that kind of take a shortcut with the IRB, and some of you know this, they might get the 3 signatures on the bottom, make 50 copies and hand them out to the kids. Where the board basically doesn't even look at the project, but the teacher uses this and the kids fill it out. That center box needs to be completed. The way we look at it, if it is not, then that tells us it has not been reviewed by the IRB. Now at ISEF, when we run into this, and we run into this a lot, particularly from the foreign countries, we then require a the signature, the people that signed that form to write us a letter saying, yes, they did indeed review this project. And that we do that a lot. We must have done that at least 20, 30 times at ISEF for some of these. So the IRB then will determine what is needed, whether a qualified scientist for something specific. An example of this could be a sleep deprivation project. Kids are working on sleep deprivation and what's going on there. This can be pretty risky, and so it's best to have a medical doctor okay this and okay the procedure, something like that. But again, this is up to the IRB to decide whether they need it. I'm not going to get too much into there are some IRBs that are better than others. And I know there's some regional fairs that don't trust the IRBs. And that's certainly understandable, where then the SRC would then double check that. There's now talk at ISEF about registering the IRBs. I'm not a fan of that. I missed the last meeting that they had a week ago. I was away. But registering the IRBs can be really onerous, particularly for large fairs that have over 300 schools. You can't be doing that. But anyway, the IRB, we have to trust somebody somewhere. So we're trusting this IRB and what it's done. So then they would fill that out, get those 3 signatures. One of the things that they are going to look at is risk. What kind of risk is involved? There are 4 areas of risk that definitely require parental consent, informed consent, because there could be some projects that really don't need that. For example, a middle school project where they're asking their classmates what their favorite color is. You really don't need to get parental permission, or there's no risk there, or informed consent, and the IRB will decide that. But if any of them are dealing with here's the risk groups. One is ingestion of anything. So if the student is asking the subject, if the student researcher is asking their subjects to ingest anything, smell anything, put anything on their skin or whatever, that's risk, and you need parental permission and informed consent. The other risk is exercise of any kind. Again, the IRB asking a student to run a quarter mile or walk a quarter mile and do a pulse recovery test or whatever, that's fine. But if you're asking the student to do something outside what they normally do in school activities, that would be considered risk. Privacy, invasion of privacy, whether it's a home life, what's going on, the student, risking with them. One study we have a lot that could be problems of fingerprint studies. What's the difference between male and female fingerprints? Might seem innocuous, but that's the only time since I've been running DVSF that we had a threat of a lawsuit. One parent didn't like their kid being fingerprinted, particularly after the fact. And then the 4th area of risk are risk groups. There are risk groups. Special ed students, handicapped students, prisoners. There's a bunch that they consider risk groups, and so obviously consent needs to be taken with all of those. So that's basically what the IRB does. They review the projects to make sure everything's okay. They recommend what it needs, and they do all this prior to research. The kid does the research, and then finally the SRC. For the local fairs, we'll look at it to see if everything is in order. And it's up to that SRC to decide whether everything's in order or whether there's a problem that they have to deal with. And the local SRC does have the authority to override the IRB. So if they fear there's a study that's just really horrible, but the IRB, didn't check any of the boxes or checked no risk and didn't need anything or whatever, that project, you could fail to qualify that project. The second part of human subjects, and this is where we have problems because it's very confusing, are projects that involve humans but aren't about humans. Typically, this is engineering projects. So as an example, say somebody wants to design a better wheelchair and they want to test it. The project has nothing to do with human subjects. It has something to do with engineering a good wheelchair, or one that can go up steps or whatever. But it is involving a human being. And that human being, once they're used to test it, that project now becomes needs to be an IRB review. No matter what happens. The exception could be the student researcher is his own tester. So if the student researcher is testing it, then that's okay. It does not need to go through IRB review or whatever. But as soon as they ask somebody else, then it needs IRB review. The other exception is sometimes student researcher needs to maybe drive a car. They've done something with a car, trying to maybe improve a rear view mirror or whatever. Obviously, they're too young if they're under 16 to drive a car, so they need somebody to test it. They could get one adult to test that, and that would be exempt. But if they're using anybody else or a bunch of adults or whatever, that requires IRB review. Are there any questions about that? That's the big problem we have. Is some of these projects you'll read, scan it, and it has nothing to do with human beings, but as you read it, they're involving a human being to test their device or their invention or whatever. So, so I have two people, Mary, that have raised their hands. So I could answer them now.
If you, yeah, so we were trying to go through the chat feature to make sure that we're not having trouble with on and off, but since there's a smaller group than expected, I think it would be okay if you answer it right now.
Okay, well, it says two. Christopher Jones.
Christopher Jones is first.
Okay, Christopher.
Okay, thank you. I was wondering, the distinction you made at the very end there, if a student had other non-experimenter subjects helping out with the wheelchair design, you need an IRB approval, but not if you had somebody driving a car for him. So I wasn't quite clear why the difference, what differentiates those cases.
Well, because it's basically, since the student cannot drive the car, they're underage. So they need somebody to test it. They can't ask another student, so that we're allowing it to be okay for an adult to be able to do that. But 99% of the times, they're asking their classmates or somebody else.
Right.
That way, then it does need IRB review.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
All right. Mary Russo.
Hi, how are you? I have a quick question. I'm new to this. I have a student who designed a survey and wanted to give it out, and we have IRB approval. I formed a committee. We did all of that, but I haven't allowed the student to start the project yet because I believe there's a form that says that a regional fair representative must sign off before the student begins. And I didn't want to have any potential issues down the road, and I'm not sure if I'm mistaken. Can you just clarify with that part?
Yep. That other form you're referring to is the Form 1B, where the student signs and the adult sponsor signs or whatever. And then there's two boxes in the middle of that Form 1B where it says the SRC needs to sign prior to approval, or the IRB could sign it prior to approval. It doesn't necessarily have to be the SRC. So that Form 1B 2A, which is that box, the IRB would also sign that one.
So there's no one from the regional fairs that has to read and approve the project ahead of time. It's really just the IRB and making sure the parental signatures are there and all of that.
Right. So you can see on the screen here, it says under 2A, it says SRC/IRB chair printed name. Mm-hmm. So to do that, but what we stress all the time is different fairs have different rules and different safeguards that they want to do. Some want to be a lot stricter, which is okay. So check with your fairs director and your fair SRC if that's okay, if they need to look at it too. So I mentioned in the beginning, there are some SRCs that don't trust the IRBs. So they want to see it also, just to make sure that the IRB is doing a good job.
Actually, Henry, she's speaking about me. This is Kathy Jaggert.
Yep.
I wasn't sure because all of a sudden this got thrown on my desk and I wasn't sure if I had to sign something, whether we were going. And Mary Russo has been very diligent in making sure everything was in place for this. And to me, I don't feel I need to sign it now. Considering what you just said to me, I don't think I need to sign it because she's just looking at injuries. Would that be something I would have to?
You can if you would look at it, but again, it depends on how trusting you are of the IRB.
Well, in this case, I am because we've actually exchanged about what 10 emails, Mary. something back
Right.
and forth. So I know what the student's doing, and if she has any more questions, she can come to me then. Okay.
Yeah,
Yes,
so,
thanks.
yeah, and for everybody, you don't, the SRC does not need to find it. The IRB signature is good enough, and that works.
Okay.
As I mentioned, though, and we've run into this, there are some teachers that get the signatures and everything, and then photocopy it 40 times and give it to each kid that's dealing with human subjects. That's not real ethical, but it happens. So again, each fair knows their population better than anybody else, so it's up to them. But local SRCs can be stricter. I know in the old days, Bucks County did not also wanted to review any human subject projects also. So
there's a question in the chat asking if number 3, part B, the very bottom of the 1B form, is what may be confusing everybody.
okay, that number 3 is to be signed by the regional SRC chair, which is the DVSF SRC chair. So you could use that. What's supposed to happen is when the kid's done and they show up at your doorstep, this is with DVSF, we look at those, and if we see there's a problem, we don't do it. And so, as Bob will tell you, what we used to do with the help of Dick Close and Bill Rissinger, we used to, before DVSF, we went over all the paperwork. And we did that this year too, to make sure everything's in order and all the forms are there or whatever. So that's what 3 is. And then 3, Bob would sign, or the director of the SRC for the regional fair would sign. We see this a lot at ISEF where that's not signed, and sometimes you don't see it. Sometimes the paper's submitted, but I'm sorry, my wife just walked in and interrupted things. Sometimes it's submitted without that signature. And when we review the projects before ISEF and their signature's not there, we just write the fair director a nasty letter. But we don't disqualify the project.
If this helps, one of the things with the 1B, look at it as 3 sections for 3 levels of approval. The first one is that the student and the parent are giving approval for the kid to participate in the project. The second section there is for whoever is reviewing the paperwork for the IRB or the SRC at your regional child fair or in the school. If it's an IRB, it could be in the school. And the very last one is when they come to Del Val, and then that's the final layer of approval before they would be able to be with an ISEF affiliated fair. So if you look at it that way, it's kind of in-home, in school, or your regional fair is part 2, and then Del Val is part 3. Does that help?
Good. That's exactly right, Mary Rita. So that's good. Again, the other big issue we have, other than IRBs not doing their job, is whether the project needs IRB review. A lot of people, if they're designing a better mouse for the computer, or if they're inventing some kind of a device or whatever, you look at that and say, well, this doesn't involve human subjects, so I don't need to do any of this. But they ask their friend to come in and try it out, then you need IRB approval. One typical project you see is, say, in sports, where somebody wants to see if a ball is better than another one, or if kicking it the right way in soccer or whatever. And obviously they can't do it, but they'll have their friends do it, and they'll measure whatever they're measuring. But because they're involving a lot of their classmates, that would need an IRB. One other thing that the IRB should look at, and sometimes missed, but you should know for SRC, or we've been running into this a lot, are medical testing and diagnosis. Some kids are developing apps that can diagnose various diseases or conditions. They're not allowed to do that. They're not doctors. Doctors can't diagnose things. Now, they could do the app, but they can't put it out there. So what we're seeing a lot is, for an example, is skin cancer. So somebody will go into a database and take different pictures of their hand, or different pictures of different kinds of cancer, benign, malignant, or whatever, and put this all together, and then you're able with your phone to take a picture of it, and hit this person's app will tell you whether you've got cancer or not. That's fine if that's as far as it goes, but right now people then are putting it on the App Store, And so what happens is they'll diagnose and say you have cancer, but the worst thing is that no, you don't have cancer. If the person ends up having cancer, there could be problems. And we're seeing a lot of this. So as soon as it goes public, or if somebody else is using it, this cannot be done. So just to let you know, this is starting to be a new trend that we're seeing over and over. And most of those projects have been disqualified in ISEF. So let me see what else I have here. The other area we run into are some kids are giving their human subjects tests, MMPI, IQ tests, whatever. A lot of the tests that you get on the internet require permission. Some of these tests require not only permission, but a fee in order to use those tests. So the big question the IRB needs to go is this test legal for the kid to use it? Now, if it's public domain, yeah, it's legal. If it's not, if people needed to purchase it or get permission from the developer of that test, that cannot be done. These things are rare, but I just want to bring them up that those things can happen, particularly with kids using those tests. One other thing here. The other thing with some human subjects, you'll find, and a lot of times you'll find this under tissue studies, students will be, if they're diabetic or looking at something like that, would be pricking their finger and collecting blood. Now, if they're doing it on themselves, then they're still going to need a tissue form. They're obviously dealing with blood. We'll get to that later. But if they're the only one, it does not need IRB. But if they're also collecting blood from other people or using other humans, then it requires an IRB, even though the study itself has to deal with tissue or with body fluids or whatever. We run into that anonymous.
Henry,
yes.
One other question came back up in the chat about before with some of those apps that people are creating. Christopher Jones wants to know if developing the imagined cancer detector is okay, as long as they don't go public. Why would it be a problem for us if they go public? Wouldn't that be on the student and the developer?
It would be, but it's on us because that project shouldn't be done. I mean, that's dangerous. It's too risky, and that can't be done. So we don't allow those kind of projects to go public.
Okay, I thought you had said that was okay as long as it didn't go public. And so,
yeah, now the kid could be developing. In fact, we had one student out at Del Val that did this not only with skin anomalies, but also with plants. And it was a great project, did a great job, set everything up. And fortunately, he did not go public with this. So the only person that saw it was him, the teacher, or whatever. That's fine. But as soon as you go public and you're giving the impression that you're diagnosing a medical thing, medical diagnosis can only be done by a licensed physician. Students can't do that kind of stuff. So again, keep in mind, and I'll be talking about this probably over and over, the whole point of these rules and regulations is risk, eliminating risk, identifying and eliminating risk. And that's what we're trying to do here. And so obviously that would be risky if they're telling somebody false information or whatever.
And then we had two people raise hands. Mary Russo.
Okay, hi. I'm sorry to ask again. I know you covered this. I just didn't want to, I was still a little gray area.
Okay.
So back to that form, I think it was the 1B. I understood the 3 sections and what you said to some degree. It was more of the timing. Does the local fair have to approve and sign that prior to the student beginning the project? I think that section 2 is the one, right? Because I'd have to go in that sequence.
Correct. So on the form 4 that we talked about, the 3 people that sign that, they have to sign that prior to review.
Yep.
And then the chair of that IRB then has to sign the form 1B prior to review. Once those are signed, the kid can go off and do the project.
Okay, the regional fair though, like Jersey Shore Science Fair, do they have to sign it somewhere? I thought it said the fair also had to sign it.
No, not on the 1B. Again, we're talking human subjects.
Right.
So keep that in mind. So the IRB could sign that form right in the middle, 2A.
Right. Mary,
Okay.
I think that Kathy said she communicated with you so much about that your IRB chair at the school, she was comfortable with them signing off that second section. When you send it to us, if that project gets to us in March, when we
Right.
review the paperwork, we would sign off on 3, but it seems that Kathy's comfortable with whoever your IRB
Yep.
chair is having them
Mhm.
sign off on section 2.
Okay.
Yeah,
I
and
just
that
want to
is
make sure
correct.
she could start it.
Yeah, that's
Thank
correct.
you.
'Cause I gave her an email confirming that it was okay to start the
It's okay.
project.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Next question from Steve.
Unmute. Steve, unmute yourself. Steve, you're muted.
There we are.
There you go.
Okay, last year we had a problem, just like we were talking about at Chester County, where a student had developed a device that would monitor various vital functions. And there was some concern about whether he was the only one and all that. We sorted that out. But would it be wise for the local SRCs to go ahead then and require the students to put a statement on anything like this, that it is not designed to diagnose or treat any condition?
Yeah, that could be fine. Again, local fairs can have stricter rules or different rules depending because of your
Yeah.
population and all that. So, and that's fine. You could do that. Just make sure that student knows and the teachers know. But that's fine, Steve.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. This was going to be the longest one. There are a couple of exceptions with IRB review with human subjects. If they are getting information, statistics or things like that, off of the internet or whatever, but they're not directly contacting humans or asking humans to do anything, it's exempt, doesn't need IRB. If it's observational behavior, if they're watching, say, people in the shopping mall, do they tend to go to the right or tend to go to the left? Is there one store, whatever? They're just observing the behavior, but they're not changing the environment anyway, then that's not the IRB. Now, if one of them decides to put a $1 bill on the floor and see who picks it up, all of a sudden you're changing the environment. That does need an IRB. We had a great project at ISEF where a student put out, let me mute this first. I'm sorry about this. I don't even know how to mute. All right, sorry about that. Mickey's going to get that. So observational studies, as long as the environment's not being manipulated. There's a project I thought was pretty neat at ISEF where a student put out a box of masks in front of the store with a sign saying, "For your protection, free masks, help yourself." Did that for a week. And then the next week he put out a box of masks with a sign saying, "For other people's protection, free mask." He's changing the environment, so that did need an IRB approval. The funny thing was the box to protect yourself got emptied. The one to protect others, only 2 masks were taken. I thought that was kind of an interesting comment. But our question was, when we saw that, was it didn't have the proper IRB review because they were just kind of watching whether the box is empty or full or how much was taken. But they're manipulating that environment, and so it is a human subject study and does require IRB review. And hopefully the IRB would then sit down with some of these risky projects and explain to the student if they could modify their experiment or they have to worry about this or that kind of stuff. That's why one of these members needs to be somebody of the medical profession or social science profession. Even a school nurse would work, but they would tend to know more about the risks of it. So that's observational. And the other one, the final one exception would be if the data they're getting, say, no matter what they're getting, if they're getting it from a qualified scientist or whatever, is anonymous and de-identified, and they're just getting the data, does not need IRB review.
And then we have a question from Kathy Jaggard.
Yeah, Kathy.
Yeah, when you talked about the mask and when you changed just the criteria, whether to say protect somebody else or protect yourself, why would that be considered something that would be an IRB? We're not really interacting with them. It's just.
Well, you're not really interacting with them, but you are. You're having other humans be part of that experiment.
Oh, okay.
So as soon as other humans are, if you're just observing it and that's it, but as soon as you do something, like I said, throw a dollar bill and see how long it takes somebody to pick it up or whatever, even though you're not doing it, you're changing the environment and you're dealing with other human subjects. And so it needs an IRB review. Two final things. One, the SRC can override the IRB. I mentioned that earlier. So your regional affairs SRCs could, if they see a real problem or they're having a problem with that IRB, they could be the deciding factor whether that project should go on or not. Also, you're going to run into schools, maybe one student from a school, and the school doesn't have an IRB and they don't want to do one. They're not giving any support to that student whatsoever. So the student needs to have this in order to do the project, but the school's not supporting them. What does that student do? Your local SRC can act as an IRB if it has the proper qualifications of the people on that SRC. So if that SRC does have a medical person, a school administrator, and another kind of teacher with their SRC committee also, then that would be okay. So the SRC can act as an IRB. Some SRCs have 3 members, some SRCs have a dozen. They want to be careful and they have all the expertise on their SRC committees. So that's pretty much it for IRBs. Again, that's the big problem and could be problems. And again, risk. We're identifying risk, and also with human subjects, this is federal regulations. Now, it doesn't apply too much to science fair, but any professional ones that don't follow this, they don't get funding and they're shut down. So if there are no more questions with human subjects, we'll move on to vertebrate animals.
Okay.
There are 2 types of work with vertebrate animals, and because of that, there are 2 types of forms that need to be filled out. Mostly what you're going to see is animals in the home or the farm. And if they're working with any animals at home, say pets, or if they're working with farm animals, which you see in a lot of rural communities or whatever, they need to complete this Form 5A. This Form 5A, then they answer all of the questions. Then the SRC, your local SRC, would fill out the middle portion of that and say, well, this is, they're feeding this animal something they don't know what's going to happen or whatever, that this needs a vet. And so then the vet should have a signature or whatever. So sometimes this form comes to you, then goes back to get a signature and comes back to you. But it's basically, we don't want risk to any animals. No animal should suffer any kind of pain or discomfort at all. And so we don't want that to happen. So we want to make sure there's proper oversight with all of that. So that's with vertebrate animals at home or in the farm. Usually the designated supervisor, you see, if you think needs a designated supervisor, which would be a Form 3, 9 times out of 10, that's a parent if they're dealing with pets. Is my dog right-pawed or left-pawed? Does my dog see colors? That kind of stuff. The parent's usually around to make sure that that dog's not going to be tortured, but we don't want the kids to get animals, take them down the basement and do things that we don't like. There are a couple of things that are prohibited. One that I could think right off would be predator-prey studies. You'd have a boa constrictor and you want to see, feed it mice and see if they prefer a brown mice over a white mouse. That's prohibited. You can't do that. Again, we don't want to put any animals, including the prey, those mice, through any kind of discomfort or pain at all. And if they are, then that project cannot be completed. The second vertebrate animal study we see are projects that are done in a lab. Usually at a university level, pharmaceutical companies, whatever, that are working with these animals. If they are working with these animals, with a mentor or whatever in the lab, they need to complete a vertebrate animal Form 5B. And this is specifically for animals being done in a research lab. Now, research labs, again, through federal regulations, also have to make sure that what they're doing is justified and the animals aren't being harmed or whatever. And each research institution has a committee called an IACUC. And the IACUC has to approve this before any kind of animal research is done. And so that IACUC at that university level will look at it. If they see there's a problem with this or any harm or discomfort to animals, more than it really needs to be done, they then will decide whether this project continue. Obviously, there will be some projects that are real risky, but needs to be done in order to find, a new vaccine or a new procedure or whatever. IACUC will approve that. So if somebody is doing that, we not only need the Form 5B, but we also need evidence that the IACUC did approve that project, in which case then it can go on. But if they're doing, again, you have to go by case, and I could bore you forever on different examples we've run into, but bottom line is they need to do this. Now, one of the things that some people get confused about is, well, the university is doing a project with mice, a neurological project or whatever. But when they're done their project or whatever, and the animal is euthanized, they might give the brain tissue to a student to study. This is not a vertebrate animal study; it's a tissue study. Tissue studies follow different rules. But even though they got it, but bottom line is they're just working with the tissue. It's for all of that kind of stuff, and that would require Form 66A, and I'm going to talk about that later. Any questions so far about vertebrate animals? Yes, Christopher.
Mhm.
The example with the boa constrictor, if the student has a pet, they're going
Right.
to be feeding that animal, they're going to feeding the snake mice no matter what.
Exactly.
But
But it's
to
not
avoid-
appropriate. It's not appropriate for a science fair project.
Okay.
Okay. There are a lot of studies that can be done. There are a lot of studies that are done. And we've kind of, as a committee over the many years, said there are some projects that just aren't appropriate for a middle schooler or a high school student to conduct. And you're right, they're going to be feeding them. But we had one thing where the student was videotaping it. That can't be done as a science fair project. Obviously, it can be done as a pet or whatever, but not as a science fair project.
All right. Thank you.
Yep. Let's see what else I have here. The exemption for vertebrate animals are, again, observational. So if the student is just observing animals in the wild or going to the zoo and observing animals, that's fine. Doesn't need any of these forms, doesn't need any prior review or whatever. But if they're going to the zoo and manipulating the environment, say if they decide to bring a boombox and play rap music for the gorilla to see what happens, they're manipulating the environment, could cause problems, then that needs to be reviewed. And obviously in that case with a zoo, you need the zoo people to okay something like that. But just observational stuff, looking at a bird feeder, again, another example is if you're taking bird seed and you're changing the color of it to see whether what birds prefer, the blue ones or whatever, you're changing the environment. That's not natural, and that needs to then be reviewed to make sure it's okay, but generally can't be done. But they could just observe it, that's fine. Now I'm going to mention this too, we talked about this for human subjects, that Form 1B, any vertebrate animal study requires prior approval by the SRC. And the SRC, I know, we had a vet, a lot of them have vets, and they'll tell you, this is not good, this is going to cause pain and suffering or whatever. And so then they would decide. So, but that requires prior approval for the SRC, and that's the Form 2A. So prior approval needs to be done, 1 with human subjects, but 2 with vertebrate animals, and the person that signs it with vertebrate animals is your fair SRC. They'll look at it, make sure that animal is not being put through any kind of nasty stuff. Any questions on that?
Henry, one that I feel like I always had kids, going back to the bird seed. If they are putting out one type of bird seed in one feeder and a different type of bird seed in another to see what the bird prefers, that's manipulating
okay.
the environment, or
that's exempt.
Okay.
It's observational. They're not doing, they're doing what they normally would do, different seeds and different feeders. That happens all the time, and that's fine. Certainly not hurting the birds at all. In fact, they're having a great time, unless they're on a diet. So if there's nothing else with vertebrate animals, let's move on to potentially hazardous biological agents. this is pretty straightforward. We see this a lot, but one of the things that can't be done is particularly bacteria growing anything in a petri dish cannot be done in a home environment. That's a black and white issue. Cannot be done at home. Home environments aren't safe. Somebody might have a father who's a microbiologist and made sure everything was set and all that kind of stuff. Still can't be done in a home environment. You never know if the dog's tail is going to knock something over. Baby brother goes in and wants to check out what's in the plates. There could be a plethora of risks that are involved there. So we want to eliminate all sorts of risks. So any kind of culturing of any kind of substance or whatever can only be done in a lab, either a BSL-1 lab or BSL-2 lab. Any pathogen that requires a BSL-3 or 4 cannot be done. It's not appropriate for a high school student, downright risky. So if they are doing any kind of culturing, and we see this with kids all the time, they're culturing this and that, they'll go to Carolina and they'll buy certain bacteria, whatever. This Form 6A needs to be completed, and it needs to be approved prior to research. So the SRC would sign 6A and would also sign that Form 1B. So you could see 6A here, different ones, and then the boxes for the qualified scientist working with that. That qualified scientist could be the teacher, or it could be a mentor that they're working with in a lab or whatever.
Henry,
Most high schools, I'll finish this, most high schools are BSL-1 lab. BSL-2 labs, some high schools have BSL-2, some do not. So it depends on the study, and that's all in the rule book. I'm not going to go into great lengths about BSL-1 and BSL-2. That's easy to find out. But again, a lot of what you're going to see are stuff done in a high school lab. That's fine. And I do know for a fact there are some high schools that do have a BSL-2 and can do that. One of the most common things that you're going to run into with microorganisms is kids are going to swab just about anything they can see. Doorknobs, handles, the floors, the chalkboard, who knows? They want to swab it and grow stuff. This is under the rules of unknown organisms. They don't know what the heck they're growing in there. And they could grow something in there that could be hazardous and make people sick or whatever. So we have to be careful. So with that, we allow that to happen. However, the safeguards is once they swab that and streak the plate, that plate then has to remain sealed and never opened again until it's just thrown into a bucket of bleach or whatever. Has to remain sealed. As soon as they open it, and some kids sometimes like to open it to take a picture or open it to do a colony count, can't do it. Now, if it's a known type of bacteria, known not to be pathogenic or BSL-1, then that's something different. Again, a lot of this is covered the rules, but they're the basic things that you have to worry about. So that. Yes. Any questions on we're just going to talk about microorganisms now. Any questions about that, Christopher?
Okay. Regarding the BSL-1, BSL-2 unknown situation, I'm imagining a student does a swab, gets a whole bunch of who knows what on their plate. I'm at a university, so we could allow the student to safely, in a hood, open it, take their pictures or whatever. But you're saying that that's just flat out not allowed.
No, if your university has a BSL-2,
yeah,
then it's allowed. BSL-2 labs can handle that.
Okay.
BSL-1s can't.
All right, so they are allowed to take pictures if they've got a safe environment, blah, 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 blah.
Right, and your lab would be considered a BSL-2 lab.
Right.
Sometimes we ask on the form that a checklist of what you have, but most universities, they're careful.
Yeah.
And they certainly aren't going to let underage students deal with stuff that could hurt them.
I never do.
Yeah, so.
Thank you.
Yeah. The other area here we're going to talk about are tissues. I mentioned this a little bit. They're getting tissues. Tissues are defined a lot of things, body fluids, animal organs, all of right here. You can see what it involves here. So these kids are working with tissues. They have to be careful with this, and they want to know where the tissues came from, all of that kind of stuff. Again, if it's coming from an animal in a lab, we need to see the IOCOOK. for that. So they need to complete Form 6B. But as you can see on the top of that form, it says all projects using any tissue listed above or must also complete Form 6A. So for tissue studies, you need to have both. The 6A is called a risk assessment. The 6B deals more with human and animal tissue. We want to know a little bit more about that tissue, including cell lines. Now, cell lines are okay. I mean, it still needs to be reviewed and needs to have prior approval, but as long as you identify what the cell line is, and most of the time it's fine, then it's going to be approved. And so that bottom part is filled out by using the mentor in the lab where they're getting the tissue or whatever. Any questions about tissue studies? Oh, okay, we're kind of running into questions. Again, the rule book is great for this. It not only kind of explains things a little thoroughly, but also justification of why these rules exist. And I'll say it again, it's all about risk. We don't want the kids hurting themselves one way or another. Now, my final thing, a couple more things I want to talk about. The final thing is kids dealing with hazardous chemicals or devices. There's been an argument that's gone on with the committee ever for the last 30 years, as far as I know. That does not require, hazardous devices do not require prior SRC approval, which seems kind of silly. You know, after they blow themselves up, then we worry about it. So then again, the discussion goes back and forth. One of the things that we don't want to do is we don't want to get these rules to be so burdensome that people don't want to do science research, the kids don't want to do science research anymore, or teachers don't want to have to do anything about it. So basically, what we're asking anybody dealing with hazardous devices or chemicals to complete a Form 3. And Bob, is this Form 3? No. Form 3 is a risk assessment. This form is a good form to have. It's a risk assessment form, and it just, again, identifying and eliminating risk. Mostly, and this could be used for anything. We've had a lot of people in our teacher seminars at ISEF demanding that every project should have a risk assessment form. I understand where they're coming from, but again, a math project really doesn't need that. If somebody's dealing with astronomy projects with their identifying galaxies or whatever, doesn't need that. But yes, some do, and it would be nice. And we always look, if we have one of those, we go, great. That means this documents adult supervision, and that's all we're looking for, is a documented adult supervision that's watching the kids so they don't blow themselves up. We had a kid making a nuclear reactor in their base, in their garage, but had the proper qualifications, and the person working with them that filled out this Form 3 knew what they were talking about. So we let this kid go. He ended up getting one of the top prizes with this, and is now involved with it. But anyway, so this form then is for anything that's hazardous, or you think is hazardous. And like I said, if SRC's asked that most projects have this Form 3, go for it. You're allowed to do that.
So Henry, a question in the chat. What about projects that are involving invertebrates, but they have alcohol, nicotine, or controlled substances? What approvals or paperwork would be needed for those type of projects?
Technically nothing, because they're invertebrates. You're allowed to torture the heck out of a moth if you want. But because they're using different chemicals or whatever, that Form 3. So, and a lot of they're dealing with protists or some other kind of microorganisms or whatever. Form 3 is nice to have, just to make sure that they're identifying what the risks are and how they're eliminating any of that. So that's the risk assessment, and it pretty much covers anything. There's an old saying: "When in doubt, fill it out." And I know when we're reviewing projects at ISEF, and it sounds a little risky, but if we know that if they've documented proper adult supervision, it's fine, works out. Any questions on hazardous devices or chemicals? Okay, looks like we're going to be on schedule, Mary Rita. This is nice. All right, two other things that come in that we look at ISEF. You should probably be looking at this too. One are team projects. There are rules involving team projects. Team project is rather than an individual has 2 or 3 members on the team. It's important that the team project stays a team for ethical reasons. So you can't have a team project and one individual displaying that project as their own. It's a team project, must remain a team, and can't be changed. So if it's a team project in the beginning of the work, it has to end as a team project. The other exception is if, say, the next year, and we'll talk about continuation, if one of the team members drops out for one reason or another, and the individual wants to continue, that's fine for this year's study. Remember, all research is judged on this year's work only. And I'll talk about continuation in a little bit. So, must be a team project. Now, say, for example, this happens a lot. You've got a team of 2, and one person for some reason can't display and enter the fair. It's still a team project. If that one person can't do it. So the awards are split or whatever, but it's a team project. To have a team project split out 2 individuals and then even go back as a team project is not ethical. This is something we look at ISEF. That's up to you guys on how you want to deal with it. Kathy.
That seems to be my Achilles heel, because I have people coming in as team projects, and all of a sudden they go, can I take a project on my own too? I said, I try to tell them you have to be with your team, but what happens if the 2 other teammates just drop out and they want to reassign it to a different category?
It depends on when they drop out.
Okay.
So if they drop out towards the end, it's still considered a team project, and they share with it. But that's a good question. It's actually come up before. Nobody can do 2 projects. Usually it's 1 project per person. So they can't do a team project and also display an individual project.
The other thing that comes up, and I don't know if your other directors have this issue, is that all of a sudden the kids will look to see who's in what category on our website and want to change their project to either math or something else which is close, because they want to get a prize and go on to Delaware Valley. I discourage that after the databases are closed. So
that issue is up to you guys, because we've seen this many times, particularly with there's quotas. Philadelphia, for example, says you only can put 3 per category. They used to play games and they had a 4th person, they put them in an unusual category or a different category, and then try to move them back. We don't allow that. Let's do that. So that's something about teams. It's just something to look at and to be aware of. It's usually not that big of an issue. The other issue is a continuation. Now, at ISEF, we also look at continuation projects to ensure that it truly is a continuation project and it's not the same project. So we look at that, and that's what that Form 7 is all about, because it makes it easier for not only the SRC to look at, but also for the judges to be able to see what's this year's and what's next. For the most part, with Del Val is we let it be a judge's decision unless it's really obvious. So when we're doing that final review and we see that current research project is the exact same as the previous one, that can't compete. It has to be within that year, January, what would it be this year? It'd be January 2022 to May 2023. If it's before that, it's not eligible. But it can be eligible as a continuation as long. Now, people ask about continuations. Well, what do you mean? Well, usually you do a project, and this basically what science is all about. You do a project, and all of a sudden some questions come up, and you want to continue to find out additional things, then you would continue that project, which is a good thing. Judges like continuations, but they're going to be making sure that the second year is not the same as the first year, and they judge that accordingly.
Henry, one quick question back for the team thing in the chat. And I think it does happen a lot. If one member of the team can't show up for the fair, is the other member still allowed to go to the fair?
Yes, but it's a team project. So say that one member shows up and they get a first place and they win $100. Well, the teammate should get $50. They can't do that. It's still considered a team project. Now, some fairs have teams as a separate category. Some put them into the regular category. Again, that's up to you guys to be fairly flexible. But getting back to continuation, again, as long as it's a valid continuation, But some people think if they're in the same category and they're doing another project, that's a continuation. That's not true. So say you're doing a geology project where you're looking at fault lines or whatever 1 year, and then the next year, for some reason, you decide to look at extraterrestrial planets, completely different. So the guideline we use is if that second year cannot have been done without what you learned in the first year, then that's a continuation. They couldn't have done that second year without something that they've learned in that first year. And that's why they continue it. For some reason, and I don't know why, kids don't like continuate. They think that continuations are bad and they'll be judged accordingly. But I tell them over and over, judges like that. That means they learned something. They also probably learned something from the judging the first year. The judges might say, did you ever try doing this? Oh, I never thought of that. So then they'll do the next year, they'll do the project, but with that suggestion from the judges. But they have to display both as a team project and are judged accordingly. I can't remember us ever disqualifying, maybe once or twice in the many years of doing that, that's been the same project, because we've disqualified it. But if it does make it to the floor, slip through the cracks, the judges will see it right away and they'll judge it accordingly. So that's all I have. They're basically the rules of the SRC. I just want to reiterate two important things. One, it's all about risk and identifying risk and eliminating risk. We don't want that. We don't want anybody getting hurt. And every year you read something in the news that some kid's doing a science fair project and something happens to the kid or the school or the lab or whatever. We don't want to have that. Two, the regional SRCs can have stricter rules. They don't have to follow this. You might have a kid say, well, the ISEF rules say this. And you said, yes, but our fair rules, we don't allow this or we do that. I know there's one fair that doesn't allow any micro projects in middle school. And they're allowed to do that, even though we kind of allow that for middle school students in doing that, as long as there's proper supervision and all of that. So. All right, I've babbled long enough. Any other questions?
Henry, the only other thing that Bob mentioned, is there a way for people to know what a BSL1 and a BSL2? Is that in the rule book, or would that be something they'd need to find out to make sure their school has either level?
It's in the rule book. It's on page, let me scan through here. Here. On page 18 of the current rules, it has levels of biological containment, explains the BSL 1, 2, 3, and 4, also the risk groups, and the little thing on top there. So that is mentioned on that. Unfortunately, reading this rule book could put you to sleep pretty quickly. And so a lot of teachers just look at the forms that they need to fill out, and that's it. But there is some good stuff in here. So maybe read it early in the morning, but don't do it before bed. But we try to put a lot of stuff in there. And there's also a section in the rule book. We all do sources of information, different websites and stuff like that you can kind of expand on a little bit.
And Henry, just let me say that we have the rule books. The rule book is on our website.
Okay. So it's there, look it over, and things will be there. For me to cover all of it would take a little bit more time, but I tried to keep it to an hour. I think we did okay.
Yeah.
You did great. So if anybody has any other questions, if you want to raise hands, I'll pull up and we can kind of go in order for just general open questions.
Yeah, I'm here for as long as you want, but other questions, and it doesn't hurt. You could do two things. One, email Bob Solomon and he can deal with it, or you can email src@societyforscience.org. That's src@societyforscience.org, and we just did our assignment. So each one of us on the committee takes 2 weeks, and we answer all the questions on that through that email. So if you're not sure, whatever, it doesn't hurt to ask a question, and we'll get back to you. Somebody on our committee will get back to it, or Bob with the DVSF will get back to you.
Yeah.
You're welcome, everybody. Good to see you all. It's been a while.
Let me just say, as a conclusion, a lot of the fair directors have set up their own SRCs. I'm encouraging all the fair directors to set up and lead their own individual SRC, because you can best handle these questions on your local level. If you have further questions about any of the rules, you can always email me, or Henry. If I don't know the answer, I'm going to Henry anyway. So, clearly feel free to reach out to us, but the purpose of this meeting and this training is so that each fair will have its own SRC.
And if I don't know the answer, I go to my committee. Our committee's pretty diverse, and we make sure we have expertise on all levels. So I'll go to. I'm not real strong with cell biology sometimes, so I will go to our cell biologist if I run into a question.
And Steve has a question.
Yes, Steve.
Steve raised his hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to, well, first of all, as everybody else is thank you also. But with the face masks project that you mentioned earlier, so just so I'm clear on that, even though people were participating in a study, they had no knowledge of that study, so there was no human informed consent required?
Right. Still need an IRB, and the IRB would generally look at this and say, well, yeah, it is a human study, but there's really no risk here because they don't know who took the mask and who didn't take the mask or whatever. So we approve it. It's gone. You don't need a qualified scientist. You don't need parental permission. You don't need any of that. But at least it was reviewed, and that's the important thing.
Okay, so as long as it's just counting the masks and not keeping track of who took them, then there's no additional paperwork required.
Yeah, you still need the Form 4.
Yeah, but you don't need the human
IRB,
consent.
and most of them will say you don't need anything else because you don't know what's going on. Humans are involved, but that's about it. So
Okay, thank you.
And then Kathy also raised her hand.
This is more, thank you, number one, for allowing my advisors and teachers to join in on this meeting. That is very helpful. At least they're informed also, the ones who want to join. Second of all, you're videotaping this. You're going to give the directors access to this video so I can share it with my advisors and teachers to help
The
us out.
plan is to upload it to the website, I believe.
It will be our YouTube channel. The website cannot handle
Hey.
the video, but we will put it on our YouTube channel and then link to it from our website once I get to all of that.
It sounds, I understand that one. I'm busy too. It sounds like a plan because it's a shame because I like to make sure anyone in the Jersey Shore Science Fair area has an opportunity to review it and have to review it again because I know I'm going to send them all a link to our booklet for interesting reading. But again, thank you. And tell your wife I said hello and I'll save her a sandwich next time.
how's your wonderful husband doing, Kathy?
He's downstairs waiting for me to cook him his club steak and his dinner up.
All right, good. And John, welcome home. I didn't know you were home.
Yeah, I got home yesterday.
Okay, nice.
There's one thing I do want to add now that we're putting on there. This was something that we talked about. We're providing this training because it's going to benefit you. It's going to benefit us. It's going to benefit the kids. A lot of that. But this training is really for the regional fairs and the people that support their SRC committees. We really, really, really want to make sure that you are making your individual school teachers aware that just because they may watch this on the YouTube channel does not mean that they now automatically can sign off on SRC papers. They're not SRC certified, signing off on 6As and 6Bs. So they can do this so that they can fill out the paperwork properly. They can have some questions answered, but ultimately the child fairs, the regional fairs, they're the ones that have the SRC approval. So just make sure that as you're sharing this with whomever, that you make that very clear to them.
I mean, like tell them when you do it, just pass it through us to make sure they don't need our signature.
Right. Like I have a great science teacher and her husband is a science professor. And they support kids all of the time. And she probably knows more than me about different things, but she's still going to need to get paperwork through whatever we go to Chester County. So, just making sure that everybody is very clear on that.
Okay.
Any final closing words before I stop the recording, Bob?
No, I think that this was great, and thanks, Henry, for doing this training and allowing us to record it.
Okay. Well, you're quite welcome. I'll get my check in the mail, though, right?
Indeed.
Okay, good. All right. Nice to see all of you again. You'll be seeing me. I won't disappear. So.
Very good.
All right.